Hello, Jon Perry here. In today's video, I sit down with Drew McCoy. He is from the YouTube channel Genetically Modified Skeptic. We met to chat about intelligent design creationist Stephen Meyer. Meyer recently did a podcast with Joe Rogan, and as you might expect, many of the things Stephen Meyer said about biology and psychology on Joe's platform were slightly less than accurate. So Drew and I decided that we would respond. We have a shorter, more polished video over on Drew's channel, but that one only addresses two of Stephen Meyer's claims. Right here on this channel, we have a much longer, more in-depth, and much more casual conversation about the entire podcast. We even talk about the Joe Rogan phenomenon in general, and Drew and I, we debate a little bit. We keep it very friendly, but we debate about the issue of platforming. Has Joe Rogan done a really bad thing by having a creationist on his show? Should educators like Drew and myself, should we have debates with or invite creationists onto our platforms to talk? It's a fairly tricky issue. We talked briefly about that old debate between Bill Nye and Ken Ham. Is it possible that that debate backfired and is what caused the funding of the Ark encounter? We also talk about a more recent debate between Dave Farina and James Tour. We end by revealing who our personal favorite science YouTubers and podcasters are. The conversation is fairly long, but Drew is a super fascinating guest. We had a wonderful conversation. If you like my channel, if you like other stuff that I've made, you're going to love this. I recommend treating it like a podcast. You can listen to it while you're driving or doing your dishes. I did include some visuals for those true fans, those heroes out there who actually do want to sit and watch the entire thing. Without further ado, here is the brilliant, the talented, the lovely Drew McCoy. The goal today is to talk about this intelligent design conversation that was had on the Joe Rogan podcast. So that was between Stephen Meyer. I'm saying his last name right. It's Meyer, not Mayer.
Meyer.
Which that's now been, 2 weeks ago?
2-3 weeks, something like that, yeah.
Yeah. And you and I are still in the works. We're still producing a more polished conversation about that over on your channel. And I just thought it'd be fun to also make this one that's casual, that we can just kind of chat about even the Joe Rogan phenomena in general, and then intelligent design in general. Just be fun to chat more casually about this.
Yeah, two things that make me pretty frustrated. So this is sure to be an interesting conversation.
Yeah. Well, before we dig into that, though, just tell everybody who you are. Who is this Drew character?
Yeah, so I'm Drew. I have a YouTube channel called Genetically Modified Skeptic. I started my YouTube channel trying to kind of debunk and argue against alternative medicine claims. And then I started talking about how alternative medicine claims overlap with religious claims. And now I talk more about religious claims, but I may have started my channel kind of as an anti-theist, being like, oh, religion is just bad, we need to eliminate religion. To where now I don't have an attitude quite like that. I define myself as a pluralist, but I do think that, just like the new atheists say, religion can be harmful in all of those ways. I just don't think that all religion is always harmful in all of the ways that someone like Christopher Hitchens or Richard Dawkins would say. And so I like to take a little bit more of a sociological view of religion, which is informed by actual long-standing research and study, rather than just kind of by I don't think that evangelical Christianity is true, so therefore I am very rational and I don't need religion in any kind of way, right? So yeah, I make videos about religion and skepticism on YouTube.
Do you consider yourself to be in the atheist YouTube world?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. And I think that at least in America and probably in Britain too, but primarily the US and Canada, the word atheist, the label atheist, is kind of a political identifier more so than it is an indication of specific position. People want to be agnostics are really just fence-sitting atheists. And I would say I am agnostic. Philosophically speaking, I am agnostic. Philosophically, I'm not an atheist. If you want to talk about specific positions, I don't assert that no God exists and I know that or whatever. I'm agnostic on that. However, in the US, when you identify as agnostic, people see that differently. They take that differently than, oh, well, you're just, you don't necessarily have a belief there, but you don't think it's knowable. It's more like, okay, so you're amenable to the gospel. Like you are ready to be brought into the fold at any time. It's just that you have some questions. I'm like, no, I mean, specifically with Christianity, they would call me an atheist, but I don't think that on the global scale of all other religions, that means that I'm an atheist. So yeah, I'm a part of atheist YouTube. I may be the biggest atheist YouTuber who's not philosophically an atheist. So
my main YouTube channel stated clearly, I just teach biology. And this channel, I just started answering a lot of more in-depth questions that people had about biology here, but most of the questions people end up giving me are religious-based. So I've ended up talking a lot about religion on this channel, which is never my intention. It's not what gets me up in the morning, right? I mean, I really like to talk about biology, and it's just that there's these overlaps. The two end up butting heads more than I think they should.
Right. I very much relate to what you've said, because my interest in my everyday life is just like sociology, psychology, anthropology. That's just, and religious studies. Those are the things that I like to study. And I'm not consuming polemical materials. I'm not really consuming, philosophical debates surrounding religion. I'm just, reading books that are just kind of mainstream, works on these things by accomplished scholars. And then I happen to notice that some of the main opponents to like mainstream, very high-level scholarship are people who are in the camp that I came from, which is evangelical Christianity from the U.S. Yeah. Okay. So that's why I have to talk about it in a way to defend something else, which I don't think has to have something to do with religion necessarily.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned earlier that like atheism is kind of a political thing in the U.S. It seems like even on like the internet, the YouTube atheist world, that there's a lot of political diversity. Would you say that's the case, or is there kind of an alignment among internet atheists?
I mean, there's definitely political diversity, like in any group, but I will say that as far as polls that I have seen that are recent, the word that a person can use to describe themselves as belonging to a progressive liberal camp in the U.S., besides for progressive, is actually atheist. Like, atheists are the most politically active religious group in the entire country. And also they tend to be, like, they score lowest in things like anti-LGBT attitudes, pro, like, affirmative action, pro, like, social welfare, things that are traditionally or typically progressive left issues. So overwhelmingly, statistically speaking, atheists are progressive liberals. I wouldn't really say leftists exactly. Okay. But yeah, there are definitely people who are not, who don't fall into that camp. And they're often pretty loud because they're a minority within a minority. So conservative atheist is like someone that's almost politically homeless. Like, they don't belong with the atheists, but they don't belong with most conservative people either. So I am politically not aligned with those people, but I do have empathy for them in understanding like what it's like to feel like, no one's on your side. I've been there before.
Yeah. So I live in Canada now. I've been here for, I think, almost 5 years. And I'm in the French part of Canada. And so there's more of, just like, the language barrier even causes more of a, I guess, buffer between the way that people think here and like American politics. Like when my wife tries to look at what's going on in America, she's so confused. Like, why does everybody have to be a liberal or a Republican? Like, it's very confusing to her just to see the kind of the extremes that people go to. Today, we're going to talk about this podcast that happened on Joe Rogan's platform. I've noticed that he is very much hated by a lot of American liberals. I tried looking this up, like why is it that American liberals hate him so much, or tend to? Well, a lot of them don't. But one of the main things that kept coming up is he platforms controversial figures a lot.
Yeah.
And this is it's a tricky thing for like this platforming issue. Like, I go back and forth on it a lot. So in this case, for example, he's had an intelligent design advocate on. I've had people on my channel. I've had Rob Stadler, who's an intelligent design guy. He writes for the Discovery Institute. I've had Perry Marshall, who wrote a book and he worked with a lot of people in the intelligent design world. In the case of Rob, he was upset with me for stuff that was in one of my videos. So I was like, well, come on and talk to me about it.
Yeah.
And so I had him on twice. So I gave him something like 4 hours altogether to talk about it. He seemed like fine with everything that we were talking about when we were talking about it, but now he writes a bunch of articles about me on the Discovery Institute website. So I don't know what happened. Something flipped him to kind of go a little bit berserk. But I've seen videos of Joe Rogan where it's just clips where it's like the most obnoxious things that he's ever said, you know?
Yeah.
And people are
sure.
kind of demonizing him. But then when I watch interviews that he does with people, I'm impressed by how good he is at pushing people that he's interviewing without being rude. Like he's an extremely skilled interviewer.
Yeah, I definitely share that, and that he's very skilled. I may have a slightly more negative opinion on that, and maybe that's because I'm a part of like a political camp that, you know, in my group of friends, people are like, oh yeah, Joe Rogan sucks, even if they haven't necessarily watched Joe Rogan, and that's just kind of like the party line. So with me, like kind of preparing for this conversation and for this podcast, I really try to do my best to keep that out of it and talk about like the specifics, because I think that's where I can be more useful, is talking about like, you know, what criteria should there be for like platforming a person or like putting on a debate and things like that, rather than just being like, oh, you know, like, well, Joe Rogan is an asshole. So I may not personally care for him, but that's not really what I'm trying to discuss, you know, in this one, just hopefully to be more productive than that.
I guess I do have a one principle for like deciding who I would have on my channel, and that is the person going to be a dick or not? Like,
yeah,
so there's certain creationists I would not have on. Like, I wouldn't have Kent Hovind on because he's just really obnoxious. It's like, can we have an adult conversation or not? That's my criteria, and I don't really.
Yeah,
I guess I don't care even how extreme some people's views are beyond that, because you can have a good. If you can have a good conversation, it's going to be interesting, and you can pick apart some of these ideas that are so controversial right now that they're causing just schisms in our country, right? But
I mean, the way that I think about this is kind of like a sociological perspective that like a huge portion of sociologists, like scholarly sociologists, tend to hold to, is that when there is large-scale change happening, especially quickly, and it doesn't have to be like just cultural change. It can be change in like industry, in the economy, in technology. These things tend to, like as Carl Sagan said, you know, make people see demons, right? Like it makes them start to resort to intuition and tribalism, just kind of like these parts of our minds that have been with us since before we could even call ourselves human. And we operate kind of on instinct. We tend to get really polarized. We engage in more like aggression. One thing that's actually been studied quite rigorously is that when people are scared, they tend to latch on to very strong, domineering male figures as leaders. So if you look at like someone like Donald Trump, like he is that. He is the perfect embodiment of something like that. And
in some ways, physically maybe not.
Yeah. That's a brand, at least. That's the brand, right? Like whether or not he is that is to be seen. But
he's very aggressive in his way. He's almost impossible for people to win debates against, because he actually is really good at just like
pigeon chess,
pushing people and triggering them and making them do things that are stupid when they're reacting to him, and then he's very skilled at harassing people.
So one thing that I've seen people say, and this is Joe Rogan included, when they're talking about how polarized everyone is, they're like, okay, well, the solution to this is that we actually talk to each other, we actually have conversations with each other, we actually see each other face to face. And I totally agree with that. Humanizing the other side is a primary solution. It is one of the primary solutions to this. However, I don't think that having conversations with the other side means necessarily like you have to invite on Graham Hancock and Alex Jones onto your podcast, or else polarization is going to just get worse. I don't think that when I'm saying I think that we need to talk to each other, I mean, you know, some of my neighbors like have like conservative bumper stickers and stuff on their cars. And yet when I walk by them, I don't scorn them and go, you know, oh, you suck, right? Like I try to just show my humanity to them, and they usually do in return. Most people will.
Oh, yeah.
And it's really it's a bottom up solution. I don't really think that it works being like, oh, we just need to be willing to talk to everyone in like this massive public forum where people are going to be communicating about this public forum and what was said in it through like purely text channels, right? So basically what this means is I don't think that Joe Rogan having a conversation with anyone and everyone and large podcasters having a conversation with anyone and everyone is really the thing that applies that solution the best. I think we have to be more nuanced than that. If you want to talk to your QAnon neighbor, though, I do encourage that. Like you should talk to people. I think that ultimately is more fruitful than hurtful.
Okay, so let's talk about this specific podcast. Actually, before doing that, even though, I just want to talk about the Discovery Institute in general, like what it is that their goals seem to be. The Discovery Institute, for those who don't know, they're the ones who are behind the intelligent design movement. So it's this kind of newer version of creationism where they've tried to brand it as being more scientific and more sophisticated. They try to say that there's an intelligent designer. It might be God, it might be some other intelligent designer, and that, you know, the most famous example I think is Michael Behe's claim that there is irreducible complexity in biology, and he does not think that sort of complexity could evolve through natural means, through means that are similar to Darwinian evolution. What they're doing is they're trying to promote this idea that science can't actually explain biology.
They're quite loud about, or at least Stephen Meyer seems quite loud about the idea that they're not all Christian, which technically is true, right? Like not everybody that is an intelligent design advocate or buys into it in some way is Christian, but is the Discovery Institute itself run primarily by Christians? Is it being donated to primarily by Christians, grants by Christian institutions?
I don't know a whole lot about specifics of their funding. They have documents on it because they're a charity, so they have documents about their taxes and stuff like that, and like they have like an $11 million a year budget.
Wow.
I know that the John Templeton Foundation used to fund them, and then they got upset with how extreme it got, and so at least publicly they stopped funding them. Do you know much about the John Templeton Foundation?
Yeah, I do, and you know, I mean, I even have friends who are scholars of religious studies, and they're not particularly religious themselves, and they've been given grants by the John Templeton Foundation. Like it's a religious trust or religious fund. You know, John Templeton was like an evangelist basically, but they do fund like scholarly institutions that are, you know, highly credible.
Yeah, they fund a lot of very legitimate research in biology and economics and so on. But the founder he definitely was not like a normal like evangelical Christian. He had a lot of unusual views, but he's very much against this idea that it was the struggle for existence, and that's basically it that created the human spirit and everything. So he's trying to find where spirituality fits into science, and it's controversial especially within the field of biology. Like when people take grants from them, it can be a problem for them, for their reputation.
Yeah,
but it's a complicated situation because they're also giving millions and millions of dollars, and when there's a giant pile of money sitting there that can help you do your research, you're just going to want to jump through the hoops that you need to get that money so you can do your research, because that's what you're there to do. So and the argument that I have, I've never taken money from them, but I do know people that have, and I try to defend them a little bit against this backlash by saying, look, if good researchers aren't taking that money, then quacks are going to take it. They're giving that money out every year, so we might as well be encouraging good researchers to take that money and do good research with it.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I totally see that reasoning. I mean, there are people that I know that have taken that, and I'm glad that it is them instead of some other scholars from devotional institutions that, like, you know, they have written statements of faith that they have to sign before they're even allowed to attend or work there. And the John Templeton Foundation will fund people who work at things like Biola, you know, and I would really rather someone from Boston University or Duke or something take that money, right?
So yeah, I know that they funded the Discovery Institute early on, but there was some sort of a fight. Like, they didn't like how extreme it was, or how. I mean, if you look at the Discovery Institute's tactics, there's a lot. Some of what they do is totally fine. They're criticizing scientists that say stuff that go beyond what they've actually discovered. I think that's totally fine. People should be ridiculed for overstating their claims.
Yeah.
The other thing that the Discovery Institute does that's fine is they point out where are these mysteries in science. But the obnoxious thing that they do is that they just lie about stuff, and they'll exaggerate. They try and trick their audiences into thinking that we don't understand things as well as we actually do. So that's very frustrating.
A lot of the tactics are really kind of purely rhetoric. You know, they're the same as you are going to get if you were going to a Christian apologetics organization. You know, you go to like Stand to Reason Ministries, which was started by a Biola graduate, Greg Kokel, and you know, you look at like Stand to Reason's website, and the rhetoric that you're going to see, the wording that you're going to see, specifically about like the Borguth-Vilenkin theorem, right, is something that Stand to Reason itself just copied homework from William Lane Craig, who has been like discredited over and over and over with his use of the Borguth-Vilenkin theorem. You know, this was a specific theorem that in classical physics like means X, Y, and Z. It doesn't mean that it is absolutely without a doubt proven that the beginning of the universe happened with like this specific type of origin event. And yeah, so you'll see things like that. And when you come from a background, I think like mine and like yours, where we were raised with really comprehensive and high-level apologetics surrounding us constantly, like our educational process had to do with kind of deconstructing the way that rhetoric works and the way that it kind of morphs your thinking. And so when I look at something like the Discovery Institute, I'm just seeing something like, you know, Frank Turek or Greg Kokel or William Lane Craig saying things in a highly manicured way that isn't necessarily directly lying, but to a layperson who's not familiar with all the terminology that's being used, you walk away from an article going, wow, most scientists actually believe that like there is no other idea except for that the Big Bang was the definitive single origin event for all of the universe, and that, you know, anything about like a big crunch theory is laughed out of the room. And people actually agree with like Christians who propose science more often than they agree with like atheistic scientists. You know, Stephen Meyer likes to say that he said several times in the Joe Rogan podcast that atheistic materialism. It's funny that he likes to call it that, because like a materialism doesn't have to be atheist, and atheism doesn't have to be materialistic. He says like it is becoming very exotic. He doesn't usually say where, but he's implying to the layperson, it is unusual to be an atheist if you are like really smart and you're an academic, which like is not true, but it also is kind of beside the point.
I think what the Discovery Institute is doing, I keep seeing them make what I would just call God of the Gaps arguments, which are not at all interesting to me. Like, when there's a mystery, I like to put a question mark there instead of put God there, right? What they're trying to do is they're trying to argue against this string of logic that some people have used to get to atheism, and that is this idea that religion exists to explain mysteries. Now, science can also explain mysteries, and it seems to be doing a better job than religion. Therefore, we don't need God anymore. I don't know how many people are atheists because of that line of reasoning, but you know, there are quotes you can find. Like Richard Dawkins said, and I wrote this down here. He said, and I think it was The Blind Watchmaker, one of his books, he said, Darwin made it possible to be an intellectually fulfilled atheist. And by that, he's basically saying, you know, Darwin explained complexities of life, therefore we can be intellectually fulfilled atheists, because that would have been a big, huge mystery before Darwin.
Yeah.
And it would have given you pause, like, there must have been a creator. The other one is from Tim Minchin, who's a comedian. I'm sure a lot of people know him. He's like, throughout history, every mystery ever solved has turned out to be not magic. These are just little quotes that people cling on to. And I know the Discovery Institute talks about this Dawkins quote all the time. In fact, there's a whole book where that's the title of the book.
Yeah.
Fulfilled Atheist. And so what they're trying to do is they're trying to say, oh, you think that Darwin can explain life? Well, it can't, because there's the origin of life. How did that happen? Or there's irreducible complexity. Darwin can't explain that, which actually it can, but that'd be a topic for another day. But the origin of life is a genuine mystery. The irreducible complexity is not a genuine mystery. That's a fake mystery. They're attacking basically theories that are explaining a lot about the universe. So they're trying to give people a reason to still need God.
I would actually say that from my read on Meyer, it seems like when it comes to his own personal story of coming to faith, and when it comes to what he usually brings the conversation around to when you're discussing science and like atheistic materialism, is not the idea that you can be intellectually fulfilled as an atheist, but that you can be like spiritually fulfilled, that you can have some kind of deeper sense of meaning or fulfillment in your life. You know, he often equates atheism or materialism with outright nihilism, and it just is so common that you're talking about science, and then Stephen Meyer is like, but the problem with this is that you can't actually have like certainty. You can't found this in some fundamental philosophical principle, which also means that life has no meaning. And you're like, whoa, where did the life has no meaning thing come from? It seems, very sudden. But I would say that most people who are not more studied in this stuff hear something like Dawkins saying that you can be an intellectually fulfilled atheist, and they don't just hear that. They're hearing that you can be an atheist and you can get the kind of fulfillment that you might get within a Christian framework. And I don't think that people at the Discovery Institute who are Christian, especially Stephen Meyer, who I'm most familiar with, want people to do that, because they themselves don't have that experience, which is okay. They don't have to find fulfillment as an atheist. If they want to be Christian to find like good feelings and fulfillment, that's fine. But they're almost saying, like, pronouncing that no one can have a different solution to this than they can.
By solution, you're saying that like the danger is just self-destructive nihilism, right? I mean, that is something that a lot of people struggle with. Like right now, I just looked at a survey on I can't remember the name of the group that does these surveys on religion.
Could be Pew Research or
Okay, that's the one. They did one on a belief in an afterlife, and they found that even though atheism / non-religious people, I think I don't remember what it is. It's surprisingly high right now in the U.S., but only 17% believe there is no afterlife or are confident that there is no afterlife. And if you think about just historically, I've been getting into like Greek mythology lately. Very few people have gone throughout their lives believing that when you die, you just die. That's a super rare thing for humans to believe all throughout history. I think a lot of people do feel like if that's the case, then everything is pointless. And a lot of people are terrified of that nihilism. And I don't know how you see that or deal with that or...
Yeah, so first of all, I'll say that the idea that nihilism is exclusive to like atheism or materialism or atheistic materialism, compounded with the idea that it is found in just one place, one philosophy, that idea within our culture comes from Christian thinking. It comes from Christian culture, Christian Renaissance and Enlightenment thinkers going, if you, like Dostoevsky is like saying that if you leave religion, then you will have like no guiding moral, or if you leave Christianity, you'll have no guiding moral principle. You'll be nihilistic. Everything will be hopeless. Everything will be meaningless. And that like you have to seek God in order to deal with that. But that is simply not the way that issue has been conceptualized throughout all culture and history. This is not universal. It is a Christian idea specifically to think that they are the only ones who have the answer, and that atheists are somehow specifically, vulnerable to nihilism and like suicidal ideation as a result of this. And so I see them pushing this attitude, which kind of translates to them being very dominionist. The Discovery Institute doesn't just want to challenge scientists. It seems like they want to challenge anything that's like an anti-Christian idea, because ultimately they want you to find meaning in their religion just like they do.
The way that they're doing that is they're trying to say that science doesn't know stuff. That's the main way that they're doing this, is that science doesn't have good answers. I was raised Mormon. I left the religion quite a while ago, and one of my cousins was leaving, and she was asking, what do you replace it with? In the church, we have answers to everything. We know what's going to happen after we die. We know, like, why things were created. We know all these things. What do you replace that with? I mean, you can replace part of the creation story with an understanding of biology, but what about all the other stuff? And I was like, well, I just replaced it with a question mark. Like, I don't know. I don't know what happens after we die. I assume that we just stay dead. But a lot of people that I know, like they just want answers. And I just feel like having questions is okay. So
Yeah.
when they're attacking science and saying, oh, look, the origin of life isn't completely solved, I'm just like, yeah, I know. Like, you could watch all of my videos on the origin of life, and it's mentioned in every single one of them. This is not yet a solved problem. I'm very clear about that. And my teaching, the textbooks that I've seen are clear about that as well. There was a part in the interview where, in the Joe Rogan interview, where Stephen Meyer said that one of the people in his group finally got Richard Dawkins to admit that the origin of life is not solved. And I was just, I was laughing at that because in Richard Dawkins' very first book, The Selfish Gene, he talked about that. He's like, no one was there. We don't know how it happened. And it's an unsolved problem. And then he gives one of several scenarios that have been proposed. But he's super clear about that in his first book. And then in, I think it's The Blind Watchmaker, he has an entire chapter about this. And it's just peppered throughout all of his stuff. He's been talking about this since forever. And I mean, what the Discovery Institute is trying to do is they're trying to say these scientists, it's not just that they don't know everything, they're lying to you. They're trying to trick you into thinking they know everything. I'm like, that is not what people are doing.
This idea that having unsolved mysteries is inherently a source of despair, that, not knowing where you're going to go after you die, if anywhere, is a cause for despair, that, you don't know exactly where the human race came from is a horrible cause of despair. All of these things, these are kind of Christian assumptions that are based in, longstanding Christian thought, and they're baked into like intelligent design type movements. You have to undermine certain ideas of like, well, just saying I don't know in certain cases rather than just jumping to a conclusion is actually the only thing we can do, the only thing that's acceptable. They'll be like, no, but that's not good enough because, it makes us, it inevitably, inherently in humanity will make us despair. So therefore we must solve it. But if you step outside of a Christian paradigm, I mean, you look at like the ultimate fulfillment of a Buddhist life, for instance. It's to literally escape existence. It's to be annihilated, to not exist anymore. I don't think that it's inherently an intuitive notion to think that like going to heaven after you die is what humans inherently want. To know your specific creator, to know all of the answers to all of these things is inherently what all humans want, and that all religious systems must strive to for people to feel fulfilled. It's historically, it's just not true.
Yeah, well, it's interesting when I like studying Greek mythology and stuff, that their views of death are usually like horrible. Like there's not even like a heaven that exists. It's just like you go to this spirit world that just seems like it kind of sucks, right? Which that's a weird. It's weird that belief became popular.
Yeah.
But with Buddhism, I'm actually, I don't fully understand it, because obviously with Buddhism, there's, when they talk about enlightenment, they're talking about becoming one with the universe, right? And that is a type of annihilation, but that's different to them than death. I mean, there's a lot of Buddhists that believe in reincarnation, or maybe
Enlightenment, I mean, in Buddhist theology, obviously it's very diverse. It's much, much older than Christianity. So it's like, Judaism, Zoroastrianism, and Buddhism are like our oldest religions that have a historical through line from the past to now. And yeah, in Buddhism, there are some people who do take an idea that it's like if you become enlightened, then you reach a state that is kind of like bliss. But I think the most long-standing popular historical view of enlightenment in Buddhism is escaping the perpetual cycle of rebirth, of reincarnation. I think the fundamental assumption of Christianity is like life is necessary and life is always good. And that kind of comes out of Judaism to a certain extent. But with Buddhism, it's like, no, life is a core component of life in existence is suffering. So if you want to escape suffering, you must escape existence. And so you become enlightened in order to like be free from rebirth. Sometimes that means you're like still existent, but outside of our kind of existence. But a lot of the time it does just mean that you just don't exist anymore. I know people actually very close to me who personally were raised Christian and always found the idea of heaven to be actually very frightening, and the idea of annihilation is much more comforting. So I just don't think there's a universal answer to what makes people feel fulfilled.
My wife is a nurse. She deals with death all the time because she's surrounded all the time. And so we talk about death all the time. I mean, it's a conversation we have not daily, but quite a bit. But it's not something that I'm excited about. But I have not been plagued by this dread and nihilism that people talk about. I know that other people do, though. A friend of mine, faith is one of these things that kind of just breaks. Like if people have a belief in God, sometimes it just stops and they can't do anything about it, even if they want to keep believing in God. He went through this, and it's been super hard for him because he really is struggling with this super negative form of nihilism. There's positive nihilism as well, but he's just plagued by this. It's really bad for him. I feel like that is behind a lot of what the Discovery Institute is fighting against. It's like they're trying to stop people from falling into that brand of nihilism.
It's a noble pursuit when you understand their perspective. However, I think that their perspective is woefully uninformed. It's based in a very siloed and dominionist way of thinking. We have the one true path to truth, and that's it. No one else has it more right than us, which is, it's a fundamentally anti-academic attitude to have, right?
Yeah, and the main thing that bothers me about what they're doing is when they just misrepresent and slander individual scientists. I mean, they've done that to me too. I'm not trying to get petty and talk about that here, but it's like when this thing that I mentioned with Richard Dawkins, where they're trying to make it seem like they finally got him to admit that the origin of life is not solved. It's like, okay, when they slander different individuals, that bothers me. And then just when they misrepresent science and what we do know, that really bothers me. Yeah. But so to talk specifically about this particular podcast, what were some of the parts in that you thought were the funniest? Like Joe Rogan, he did a couple of really good pushbacks.
So I'll say that when it came to actually talking about biology, Rogan was just so way out of his depth, as I would be.
Yeah.
I'm not calling him a name or something like that by saying that, just most people would be. So he kind of just let Meyer just say whatever, and then would be like, okay, now I'm going to ask you about something that I can actually ask you about.
I was actually fairly impressed with him, because at one point Meyer was saying that you can get like the beak shape to evolve, but you can't get a beak to evolve. And Joe Rogan did stop him there. And is like, we're talking about huge time scales here. The thing that can shape a beak can also build one.
And Meyer goes, oh, well, time is always the hero of the plot, and then moves on.
There were things that, of course, were beyond his ability to push back on, but he did an okay job. I wasn't that overall, I think you said you couldn't stand watching that thing, but I actually thought it was pretty interesting. I enjoyed having Meyer pushed in the way that he was, having him talk so much about like his backstory, and so you could understand this. And actually, there was last time I was on your show, I said that I was convinced that Meyer was deliberately misleading his audience. I actually don't think that anymore. I think that Meyer is probably just very convinced through things like cognitive dissonance and so on. Because my perspective before was like, there's no way that someone with this much training could be making these mistakes when talking about these things. But when you just understand cognitive bias and how that works,
yeah,
of course that's possible. I was not I was not being open enough to the possibilities that could have been happening there. So
I believe that Meyer believes what he's saying. I don't think he's a used car salesman. I just think that he's a car salesman who believes in his product, even if they are lemons sometimes. I mean, yeah, like I think that a lot of the time we look at people who disagree with us and think that, oh, because of what we know, there's no way that they could possibly be genuine in what they're thinking. But first of all, yeah, like cognitive bias is something that's so inescapable that we are engaging in it right now and don't even necessarily realize that. It's a harsh reality that everybody has to accept. And it's something that both Joe and Meyer were saying in the podcast, like, you got to watch out for groupthink. You got to watch out for groupthink. Mm-hmm. By the way, I go to church, and I think that like understanding memetics can also really help us when we're talking about religion. Now, I think that the way that Richard Dawkins and Christopher Hitchens, like especially the way that Dawkins would talk about memetics when it comes to religion, was so reductive. I don't think that all religion are just parasitic memes. But I do think that they're like there's validity to memetics, and that's something that like most scholars of religion think. It's just that it's not so simple that that's all there is to religion. There's actually adaptive benefit to religion too. But there are ideas that basically are very convincing, and they are good at self-replicating, and they tend to spread, and doesn't necessarily mean there's truth to them. It's just that they're convincing, like the idea that you're going to be burned for all eternity if you disagree with a certain conclusion. There's an example of a really convincing memetic, But to bring it back to what I thought was funny, probably the funniest moment for me was, so Joe did a very good job of pushing back on, trying to understand where Meyer's religion fit into this, which is something that Meyer kind of like danced around at times. But then Joe at one point was like, well, I'm just really happy that you're willing to talk about this because so many people do dance around this issue. I'm glad that you're willing to just admit that there is, subjective religious experience involved in this. And then Meyer suddenly kind of started talking about that much more openly, which I think was a brilliant move for Joe, for just making the podcast more in depth and helping the listener see his background more. But at one point he goes, Meyer was really dancing around a lot of Joe's questions and basically being like, no, I believe this because of scientific reasons, but I also believe this scientific stuff because of my personal reasons. But my personal reasons don't cause any bias. I just believe science because of science. Contradictory answers. And Joe's like, so when you came to studying intelligent design, did you have like a certain conclusion that you would already reach because of religious reasons, and then you wanted to look more into that, study that, and back that up more thoroughly? And Meyer's like, oh, well, I believe certain things, but no, I wasn't biased because of that. And Joe's like, what are you after? And Meyer goes, oh, I do have an axe to grind. I just want to know the truth. And Joe goes, right. Like, I thought that was pretty funny in that context, but you could make that argument about anybody that he interviews, but it just, I felt like it was very appropriate in that specific instance.
One of the things that he did that I liked is Meyer was talking about, he believes in the resurrection of Jesus because people have given their testimony that Jesus was resurrected. And Joe Rogan stopped and he's like, well, yeah, but people give their testimony that Bigfoot exists.
Yeah.
That was pretty good.
That was a pretty good one. That will likely be in my I've yet to edit that part in, but that will likely be in just a little preview section of our video together on my channel. It's too good not to put in there.
Yeah, there were a lot of little gems in there. So I appreciated that. Now, you said that you were also very frustrated when you were watching it. What were the things that frustrated you the most?
So, I mean, you know, I've expressed my interest in religious psychology. That's like one of the main things that I study. I've looked all over the U.S. for a university where I could get a master's in cognitive science of religion, but it doesn't really seem like that degree exists. I'd have to get like an anthropology degree with special elective courses in religion and psychology. But yeah, so Meyer over and over invoked ideas in religious psychology, or just, you know, in psychology, like social psychology in general. Like he's talking about how groupthink exists, and that's why the Discovery Institute is not platformed. That's why they don't like him, especially that, you know, biologists see evolutionary biology as kind of this sacred belief because it functions in a similar way to like religious ideas do, mythology does. It gives them some kind of fulfillment. I think that's legitimate. That does really happen. There were ideas where he was saying that, like, you know, people are biased against people who believe in the Bible because they have anti-religious ideas. And Joe would bring up ideas about religious psychology and be like, you know, people in cults get manipulated in this way, and they feel very fulfilled. They feel like they're having these deep experiences that confirm their belief system, which was instilled by like this cult leader or whatever. Or, you know, the people who write religious texts often are trying to codify power. They're trying to structure power with their writing, and they'll appeal to the lowest common denominator in certain ways in order to gain power from, basically, people will utilize populist argumentation and populist ideas in order to codify power. And does the Bible have something like that? And every single time Joe would bring up something in religious psychology, which is perfectly legitimate to talk about, Meyer would be like, no, like that is just showing bias against Christians. Or what's probably more egregious than saying that is, well, learned philosophers like myself and my colleagues, including people on the other side of this divide, we don't talk about each other's motivations. We just focus on the argument that's at hand. We just get into, you know, the actual public evidence for like the resurrection of Jesus or for intelligent design. We don't talk about each other's motivations or religious background or anything like that. And then he would move on as if he's answered the question. And so there's this massive double standard that happened it was applied over and over and over throughout the podcast. And Joe never really wrangled him on it. I mean, I've made videos about religious psychology, and multiple videos where I've had other people from the Discovery Institute, Dr. Jonathan McClatchy, say, you know, this is just insulting to say this, to say that religious believers, you know, might believe because of this sociological reason rather than debating us on the reasons that we give. And I'm like, well, yeah, it is insulting if I'm just using that as a rote alternative to thinking. If I'm just saying that the only reason you could possibly believe is because, you know, you have some cognitive bias and you're stupid or whatever. But bringing up actual rigorous theories which have been tested and have, you know, large stores of empirical data behind them is a necessary component to this conversation. And it cuts both ways. There's, you know, research about why atheists think the things that they do. And if you want to bring that up as a Christian, I'm happy to discuss that. Like, I encourage us to discuss. I talk about it on my own. I say things that atheists don't like on my channel, and it usually comes from a place of just data from that's backing up some kind of psychological model that's not flattering to atheists or to anyone. And if there's any type of science that I see religious apologists of all sorts denying, it is the psychology of religion, more so than biology, more so than anthropology even. And I think it's because psychology is a much newer field. They don't have any historical precedent of particularly educated apologists grappling with psychological ideas. Freud didn't exist that long ago, and there's sure as hell are no people that are grappling with the ideas of like Wilhelm Wundt, like in the 1940s and 50s, inventing like experimental psychology. No one is actually substantially trying to counter Carl Rogers in a way that uses some kind of scientific model or scientific argumentation to argue secular psychology. They just say, this is insulting, let's move on, or no, that's not relevant here, or they do something which Meyer I don't think would do and just say, oh, that's just demons. They invoke some kind of supernatural monster to explain it or combat it. So yeah, that's my rant on, I think that the way that Meyer and the Discovery Institute handles religious psychology is absolutely abysmal and kind of embarrassing. I would have no problem with him saying, I'm not a sociologist or psychologist, which he did, and then being like, yeah, I can't really speak on that. If he didn't then go on to speak on matters of religious psychology and sociology in order to back up his very own arguments. Like the resurrection of Jesus argument I'll be discussing in my video on my channel. It's he's talking about motivation and the way that psychology works without any kind of source whatsoever, and then saying that like this is one of the fundamental reasons he has his entire worldview. It's like, whoa, come on, man, it's a double standard.
Yeah. There was a couple of interesting things that I noticed. One was that he was talking about a scientist who quote mines people and who misrepresents their research in the world of physics, because it was a guy who was against the Big Bang, right?
Yeah.
It was really easy for him to see these tactics of quote mining, these types of misrepresentations of science, but then he would go do those exact same things with biology. That was pretty interesting for me to watch, that he's capable of seeing this in one area and not in the other, or unless he's doing it intentionally.
Yeah.
That was really interesting to see. He did a pretty good job of describing how it is that we came to our understanding of the Big Bang. He took things too far, but by saying that like we understand, or that because of what we know from the Big Bang, that there was a definite start where, a lot of people are like, we're extrapolating backwards and we get to a point. And so that's what we're calling the Big Bang.
Right.
He's being much more like definitive about what that means.
Theological on what that means.
Yeah. Anything else you want to talk about that really bothered you or just stood out during that interview?
I think that this is kind of like a part of my discussion of platforming, which I hope that we can explore some more.
Yeah. Let's do that.
I don't think that the way that people like Stephen Meyer and another person that Joe Rogan actually invoked in this podcast, Graham Hancock, I don't think that the way that they gain notoriety or interact with their audience is primarily through delivering, scientific understanding or explanations or data sets or anything like that, or explaining experiments in the same way that a lot of other more reputable scientists would. One of their main strengths is rhetoric. Graham Hancock is a very influential and emotive speaker. I think that just listening to the guy makes you think that like maybe Atlantis is out there. I kind of hope it is, because this guy is very moving with the way he talks. And Stephen Meyer, if you're used to listening to Christian apologists, like I am, unfortunately, you hear a lot of the specific phrasing that he's taking from people like William Lane Craig, and these turns of phrase that he uses are meant to appeal to lay people and convince them, make them feel something, and bring them over to this side where they start thinking things about science or about academia or intellectual matters in general because this bit of rhetoric was so compelling. But it doesn't change the fact that it is rhetoric. I've unpacked that in my long-form video when we're talking about some religious psychology stuff. He uses specific turns of phrase in order to sneak in a bunch of premises. And like you're saying, I didn't in my video, and I'm not trying to accuse him of being purposely deceptive. I think that he thinks these bits of rhetoric are legitimate arguments. They're valid. I mean, this is what like William Lane Craig does all the time. You know, you can't make an argument from evil that God sends people to hell, because the theology actually is that you send yourself to hell. How's that any different? I don't know, but it is convincing to people. So I think that, you know, Joe has this idea, and a lot of people have this idea, that we should talk to each other, that we need to break down these barriers, and the only way we can do it is through conversation. But I think that a lot of people assume that, or can overestimate Joe's ability and their own ability to speak to someone who is highly trained in rhetoric and see through it. There were many times when Joe did not see through it. And it's not because he's stupid. It's not because he's not a good interviewer. It's because Stephen Meyer is brilliant at using this kind of rhetoric, because he has like a multi-decade career of using Christian apologetics. And this is what it primarily is. And so I'm not really confident in Joe Rogan, or most people, not even my ability, to have a conversation with someone like Stephen Meyer and be able to effectively unpack all of these things in a way which is going to make a useful conversation to the consumer. So I think that while I agree with this general principle of we should talk to each other, I think that the way that this conversation is had in a public forum needs to be very, it's hard to say controlled, but like intricately planned for and intentional, so that the conversation facilitates learning and constructive dialogue on the part of the consumer, the viewer, not just like the self-satisfaction of the person who interviewed him. Well,
I told you I've had Rob Stadler on. I mean, he's not a polished. He's not a polished bullshitter. He's a scientist who is a Christian, and he's convinced that there's problems with origin of life research, and he didn't like some stuff that I said in my video. I had him on there. I really enjoyed those conversations. I think we had a fine time. James Tour, you know who James Tour is?
Yeah, I'm less familiar with him than with Stephen Meyer, but yeah, I'm aware of him.
He and I were in conversations about doing something together, because the stuff that he was saying was just flat out wrong. Then Dave Farina just did one with him, and it just went nowhere. I don't know if you saw that, but
I didn't see it, but I have heard about it. Yeah, I've heard a lot about it.
James' tour is very intense, and Dave got pretty intense, and the two of them just couldn't really maintain a conversation that was productive. I really like Dave's stuff. He has a series on chemistry that he has on his channel. It's super good. It's just an introduction to chemistry. Really good stuff. Most of his stuff is just these, basic science lessons, or basic even like politics lessons and history lessons. But he also does these more polemic things where he'll go off on people and criticize them. And it's a little bit, it's a little intense for my style. Is what I've told him. Like, he knows that, I don't share his stuff through Stated Clearly very often, because it's just so firebrand. But I do share his stuff on, basic chemistry. But yeah, I feel like they ended up clashing in a way that was not that productive. It just got too personal during that debate.
Yeah, I think that when educators, people who have the ability to have a substantial debate end up kind of doing name calling, it really undermines their credibility to a large portion of the audience, and it makes it to where they can be, I think, less productive. And so, I'm not trying to necessarily direct that toward Dave specifically. I think that's just true in general. If getting into polemics, getting into just insulting the other side is something that we inevitably do. I think you don't have to. You don't, like someone like me or someone like you doesn't have to go, I think there's room for all types in order for all types to exist when it comes to like getting into polemical diatribes that have a bunch of cursing involved. People will do that. But then people like you and I think, have to deliberately encourage educators to stay on topic and produce things that are more manicured and are also more humanizing of one side for the benefit of the other side receiving it.
Well, I guess I don't fully agree with you there, because I think that there's with Dave's thing, I'm like, is there a pocket of the audience where that was great for them? I'm sure that there was, right? Because people like that kind of debate, and it's fiery. I mean, it definitely got a lot of eyes on the issue. Part of the drama of it got attention to this debate, and there's value in that, right? But it's just not the tactic that I would use. I don't really feel like it's all that my business to try and get other communicators to communicate the way that I do or in the tone that I do. I think it's fine to have people that are a little bit, firebrand. Yeah. But it's not my style, and I don't even like watching it. I don't even know if I finished listening to that debate. I might have. It was in chunks that I had to listen to that. It was just too much.
Right. It's not something I would really enjoy listening to either, because I've experienced so much vitriol when just kind of expressing that I don't agree with the status quo here in the Bible Belt, that I don't need to listen to any more of that. I know what it's like. But I do think that it's like there can be benefit to it. It can bring eyes. But there also can be a danger to both either going like really firebrand, but also just in being willing to platform and debate and put someone who does not have credentials in what they're talking about, who's just good at rhetoric, next to someone who does, who is qualified to talk about what they're talking about. So
I've heard that argument. It's come up a lot with COVID, like with vaccines and stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Is with the Joe Rogan podcast, because he wanted to have the Kennedy guy that
RFK Jr.
Yeah, RFK Jr. go up against this biologist who works on vaccines.
Mm-hmm.
And I can tell, looking at this, like this biologist that he wanted to have on there to talk about it, the guy he's
probably not trained in rhetoric. He's probably just doing research and going about his calm life. He's not really trying.
Well, I mean, the problem is that they're just going to focus on, well, you're making health recommendations, but you're not healthy. It's super easy to discredit the guy by just poking at his nervousness or his obesity. It's like that. That's all you have to do to win these arguments. You don't have to have any facts. You can just make fun of the person.
Exactly.
And a huge chunk of your audience is going to be on your side. So I can see why that guy in particular wouldn't do it. But you would think that this part of the medical community that really focuses on vaccines, they should have people that are public speakers that could go do that.
Yes.
I do think that this guy needs to be addressed. Like, you're just letting him say whatever he wants and no one is there to counter. That's not good.
Right.
So we should have someone who can counter it. I would be totally happy to have Steve Meyer to do some sort of presentation with Stephen Meyer specifically about his claims that genetic information cannot evolve, and his claims about the genetic code, because I think what we could do, if it was me and him, because I understand this stuff inside and out, I could really sit down with him and try and figure out, what exactly do you mean when you say this?
Yeah.
Because we have all of this data and all of this information right here. What's actually going on in your head when you're saying these things? I think that could be a productive conversation. Maybe I'm being overly confident in my skills here. Maybe he could just use his rhetoric to win in a discussion like that. But I actually think that because this is a topic that I understand so well, if we could have rules to keep this focused on this, these are the questions we want to dig into, I think it could be productive.
I agree with you on that. I think that you would be a good person to talk about this alongside Meyer. I think that'd be a fruitful discussion. If I was to do it, I know that tons of my audience would be like, "Oh yeah, Drew, you should totally debate him." That would not be a good idea. I don't study biology. Like, I could probably debate him on psychology, but still I wouldn't be the right person to do that because I don't even have a graduate degree in that. And so it's I totally agree with you that I think that it's dangerous to just expect ideas that are more extreme or conspiratorial to just die in darkness, that they can just be suffocated out of existence. There's a reason why these ideas latch on and why they can grow in the dark. You know, a lot of the time they speak to us. They speak to our dark side. They speak to the fact that we want to feel special. They speak to the fact that a lot of the time we are ignorant and yet overestimate how much we understand. And so, you know, these ideas of like the moon landing didn't happen and the government really was doing this with it. It makes people feel enlightened and special and educated when they believe something like that. We should not expect that to go away if we just don't address it.
Right.
And so, yeah, I totally agree with you. I think there should be trained like epidemiologists who are out here representing this stuff, delivering, first of all, education in a way that's not in a debate format, but are capable of taking on a debate and are specially skilled and trained in delivering this in that format for people who are interested in it. That said, there is I think that is not necessarily a popular opinion among the people who like really don't like Joe Rogan.
Right.
They're like, okay, the opposite of his idea is we should never talk to conspiracy theorists. And so that's why I believe that, because he's my political enemy. And so I believe the opposite of him. But I think that that's a mistake. I also think that just thinking we should just debate everyone, not particularly carefully, as long as we are like a pretty skilled interviewer, but not specialize in any kind of field of science, someone like Joe Rogan. You know, when the do you remember the Ken Ham, Bill Nye debate that happened in like 2016 or maybe earlier than that? So people that went there to see Bill Nye walked away from it and were like, wow, that Ken Ham guy was an idiot and he got absolutely destroyed. And, you know, like, what is it? Like Rachel Maddow is like, oh yeah, Bill Nye destroyed him. He's like such a dumbass. And then this crazy thing happens within like a year of that debate. The Ark Encounter, like $185 some odd million structure, gets funded because so many people saw him debating someone who represented like the scientific establishment and going against that. And so creationists and non-creationists alike were like, this guy represents something that I believe in. And so he was kind of up there either for the slaughter, and so I feel bad for him, and he represents me in a way, so I'm going to donate. Or it's like, no, Bill Nye just didn't understand what, you know, Ken Ham was saying, and I'm going to go donate to this guy because he's at least willing to put himself out there. And so, you know, things do backfire. It's just, it's not so simple as every debate with a conspiracy theorist backfires, or, you know, we should debate every conspiracy theorist on the biggest platform possible with no particular rules. It's just very complicated, and political discourse doesn't like to get into complicated solutions to problems like this. They just like to scream at the other side and go, I'm smarter than you.
You're right. This is a complicated problem. The platforming issue is really complicated. I still don't know. I mean, I guess in every individual case I would have different opinions.
I think that's reasonable.
These things to be taken separately.
Yeah.
And there's going to be people that totally disagree with me for being okay with certain types of platforming. Like right now, as far as vaccines go, for example, we are no longer in a position where getting a vaccine or not for COVID is a life and death situation. So I actually think that right now is a great time to start debating this. And we have a little bit more history and a little bit more understanding of what the actual side effects were to the vaccine, what percentages of people actually had issues with myocarditis and all these different things. So it seems like, well, right now is a great time to get someone who, especially if it's someone who's also trained in rhetoric, to at least call him out when there's rhetoric going on. One of the interesting things about Joe Rogan that I've noticed is that he's actually convincible. You can convince him like, hey, this is dangerous for these reasons. So if we're going to have this conversation, can we put in these safeguards? I think that he can be convinced to put in safeguards. Like, we're going to have referees that are there just to fact check, that are there in the room. There are ways that you could have this conversation.
I would hope so.
Okay.
Yeah.
I don't know what it would look like, but it's like we can't just not address these things, because the vaccine hesitancy, it's millions of people that are scared of this vaccine. There's millions of people that didn't take it because they thought that it was dangerous, and there are legitimate side effects. And for those people, that's their life, that's their story. So how do we deal with that as a society?
Yeah, it would be nice if there were people that were able to talk about those outlier cases in a way that puts them in perspective, acknowledges them without just saying like, oh, those are just people crying wolf, because they're not, but they're also a statistical anomaly, basically. And we need to be able to talk about this. Like,
right. I don't even know talking about that. I mean, but it just sucks to be the statistical anomaly.
Yeah,
oh, God.
For sure.
Yeah. And it sucks a lot. And you can get a lot of publicity talking about it, because there's people that, I mean, it's really interesting dynamics, and there really are companies making millions, billions of dollars off of this vaccine, and that motivates them to do things that are not necessarily in everyone's best interest. And we have to acknowledge that, and we have to talk about it. And if any sort of corruption is discovered, it has to be revealed. I mean, these are things that are very important to talk about. I guess in general, I do lean more towards Rogan's idea of more conversation is better, but there are real dangers with it, where if you're platforming someone with really dangerous ideas, you're spreading those dangerous. I mean, Joe Rogan's podcast, for example, he has such a huge audience that it's something that he has to very carefully consider. And it actually does seem like he fries. Like there was a big apology he gave, the Spotify drama. He gave this big apology and said that he was going to try to be more careful. And when he had a really controversial person on, especially with medical issues, he would then have other people on that can counter that.
Yeah.
I don't know if he has been doing that, but
you can easily argue too that like that's not actually going to undo damage. People can easily listen to one podcast. Like, I know of people that I went to college with, that I used to live in my old apartment building. Like they listen to like Joe Rogan, and they're totally like have sane ideas about archaeology. And then they listen to like the Graham Hancock episode. And I'm like, are you seriously telling me that you believe in like 10,000-year-old mermaid culture now? Like, where did this come from? And it's like, oh, Joe Rogan will absolutely have somebody on several weeks later that's like a legitimate archaeologist talking about, I don't know, like the discovery of like Homo naledi, and just basically spitting facts that can actually be verified, rather than conspiracy theories. But sometimes at that point, the damage is done. And so, again, I'm not saying that it's like the solution is just be like, oh, Joe Rogan should not be allowed to have his podcast anymore, which is what some people say. I think that's maybe a stretch, but I think there's a very strong argument that he could do more for there to be safeguards in place in order to not misinform his audience. Even if, considering his audience may listen at some points and not listen at others, like there are things that can be done to do better. I hope that he'll be open to doing better in the future, but all of us, myself included, a lot of the time get focused on, well, this is a controversial issue. This will get ratings. This will get views. So I'm going to talk about this now. And that's a factor for it.
Yeah, of course there are perverse motives for anyone who has a podcast to have stuff on that's edgier. But yeah, it's a hard problem, because also at the end of the day, it's like it's a little empire that he's built. He gets to do what he wants. Yeah. And that's America, So
so to confound us even more, get us into even more difficult territory possibly, I had a question for you. Because I've been on the receiving end of certain accusations surrounding this because of my stance that I've made public on it. Do you think that there is ever a time to disregard a person's argument for something? Like, say a public figure puts out an argument for or against something. Is there a time to ever disregard that argument and be like, this argument is not actually the thing we should be focusing on. This is an aside. The real issue is like the person's institutional affiliation, the person's history, the person's motivations. Is that ever appropriate to do?
So yeah, you're asking, should a person's reputation matter as to how much attention we give them, right?
In a way, yeah.
I mean, for that, I would say absolutely. I mean, I have to do this all the time when I'm considering if I'm going to spend time reading a paper, right, or a piece of research. If I know that the researcher who wrote it does a bunch of bad research, I'm not going to waste my time reading it, which is unfortunate because they might. So it doesn't matter where the truth comes from. Like, a horrible person can tell you the truth, and what matters is what's true, right, ultimately. But you can definitely tell how likely is it that this person is telling the truth based on their reputation. That's definitely we make those judgments all the time. And I do think it makes sense to talk about a person's history and a person's reputation, at least somewhat, before you address or as you're addressing an actual claim that they've made. But ultimately, I mean, what ultimately matters is what's correct and what's not. And of course, a bad person can be correct about something. And, a broken clock is right twice a day, right?
Yeah.
So, yeah, I think maybe the most obvious situation that I've had with this is the origin of COVID. A lot of people think that we know for sure that it was the wildlife trade that caused this. A lot of people on the left think that that's like totally, all the scientists agree that that's what's happened.
Yeah.
In reality, that has not been demonstrated. The lab leak hypothesis has not been actually ruled out. It's only been ruled out rhetorically. We can't say one way or the other, but the two main hypotheses that still exist are that this could have been a research-related accident, or it could have been a wildlife trade, the spillover event.
Yeah.
Both of those ideas are actually still valid. But Donald Trump was the loudest and earliest lab leak proponent, you're talking about this, using his megaphone to talk about this. And so people have refused to consider that. And it's been labeled racist and so on because he was saying racist things. He was like using slurs and stuff when he was talking about it. So this is extremely unfortunate because we really do want to know exactly how this virus came about, because knowing this will help us prevent viruses in the future. But there's so much political backlash. Like, if this was a research-related accident, man, that's way worse for everybody.
Yeah.
Because it's like people's confidence in science is going to go out the window. You could say that the government of China is more to blame because they probably would have known, and that means that there was a cover-up. So there's going to be political ramifications for U.S. Chinese relationships. It's a very expensive thing if it's true, right?
Yeah.
But we do want to know what happened, and we can't just throw this away because it's Trump who said it first.
Yeah.
He was not the first person who said it, but he was the first person recognized for having said it.
Yeah, that's a good illustration of a counterpoint to kind of my position that I've put out there a little bit more recently. Mm-hmm. So like Daily Wire rising star Matt Walsh, who I don't know if you've heard from much.
Yeah, I know who that is.
Yeah, he's talked a whole lot about like trans issues. And basically now we've gotten to the point where having discussions about trans healthcare in the U.S. is not having discussions about healthcare. It's having conversations about a grand cabal of internationally, politically affiliated, I don't want to get this completely demonetized, so P words, trying to like mutilate children because they get personal pleasure out of it. And I mean, I have thousands of people in my own audience who, when I say, being trans is like, it's a normal thing. Like, it's okay if you're trans, like, cool. They'll be like, whoa, you are promoting like intentional castration of 3-year-olds? And I'm like, what? What are you talking about? Right. And it's because like the rhetoric that Matt Walsh spreads is so inflammatory. Like the idea of whether or not children should go on to, like, should have like gender affirming medical care at certain ages is a valid conversation. I just don't think it's one that's outside of the relationship of a doctor, a parent, and a child. It's not really for Matt Walsh to have and to tell everyone in America that they must have too. And so, it gets escalated from, it's kind of like a Mott and Bailey. So he puts out this idea of, what I'm trying to do is just protect children. That's, or like, I'm trying to get at like this big cabal of abusers. And we have to like really, really take them down and destroy them. They're horrible and evil. And then you go a little bit further and he's like, all I'm trying to do is protect children. That's really my ultimate goal. I just want to protect innocent kids. However, when you read his books, like his most recent book that came out in 2020, maybe that's not his most recent book then. It's called Church of Cowards. The beginning of the book starts with the fundamental ideas of the left. Well, first of all, the left is fundamentally opposed to me and to traditionalism, to the right, everything I represent. The basis for the left is selfishness. And the basis of selfishness is metaphysical evil as found in the literal character of the devil. So what you get is you have people saying, oh, I just want to, I want to protect children from being mutilated by doctors who just care about money more than they care about kids. Presents no statistics that show that this isn't like an epidemic. He actually was outed on Joe Rogan. He was having a conversation with Joe Rogan. He said there's millions, tens of millions of children who are being castrated. And then Joe Rogan's like, really? You really think there's that many? And he's like, oh yeah, I'm totally sure. Joe Rogan looks up how many kids are receiving any kind of gender-affirming surgery, and it was like 8,000 in like 4 years in the entire continent, And but the ultimate basis of this idea is that Matt Walsh is an extremely religious Catholic who quite literally believes that if you are not a Catholic Christian, you literally worship the devil, and that the devil is deceiving you. He thinks that the only reason people are gay is because the devil puts their fingers in the gay people's minds and turns them gay. And so it's like, I've put up this video where I'm talking about his arguments are a smokescreen. Ultimately, where this is coming from, it's not based in statistics. It's not based in, well, we need to understand gender through a scientific lens. He doesn't care about the science. He cares about the Catholic Church not being defied metaphysically.
Yeah, I think it's perfectly legitimate to understand people's motives. I mean, like it was very important to understand Trump's motives. He's trying to not get blamed himself for the COVID response.
I mean, the KKK would put out there that their ultimate goal was just to protect white women. That we just want to keep white women safe. When we all know that that's not what they're trying to do. And so, I mean, I see the anti-trans panic from extremists like Walsh as being really the same thing. So for the same reason, I'm not going to contend with the idea that he's just trying to protect, white women. I'm going to be like, no, you're racist. That's what's going on. I'm going to be like, no, you hate people who don't agree with your religion is the problem.
Yeah, I do think it's good to point out people's motives. But of course that can't be the end of the argument. Like, I mean, if you're going to take on someone's argument, I think you need to look at the meat of their argument and address that properly too. But yeah, for sure, people's motives have a huge, I mean, we care about this all the time. We care about this if someone murdered someone else, we care why.
Yeah.
Like, because that can tell us about this person's likelihood of doing it in the future, right? So that's going to determine how long they're going to be in prison. Understanding motives I think is really important. It's also really hard to do accurately. People call it mind reading. Like, of course you can't mind read, but if this scientist is being paid by Tyson meat industry,
right,
and he's the one telling you that hot dogs are not at all linked to cancer, well,
right,
You shouldn't trust him as much as a scientist that doesn't have affiliations who's saying, "Oh, we noticed this link." Like you just know knowing people's motivations is important.
Yeah.
In Oregon, there's a law where if your doctor has taken any money, including just a free lunch from someone who is a lobbyist for the drug companies, they have to document that. And there's a file, there's a website you can go look on, and all that stuff is documented. Like I looked at how many lunches my doctor had for presentations by such and such drug company. And that helped me actually make good decisions when he was recommending drugs, that I should be taking. So it's like, we should know motives. Transparency is good.
Yeah.
So, I think you're doing a great job revealing that stuff. But if that's where you end the argument, I don't think that's appropriate. I think you actually do have to address the meat of the issue.
Yeah, I'm not. So I mean, it's like, I guess I would disagree with the phrasing. I do believe like the meat of the issue ultimately is the motive when it comes to people who are ideological extremists. And so addressing the motivation, like in the case of Walsh or in the case of like the KKK, is the that is the meat. However, I do agree that doesn't mean that you shouldn't ever address any of their arguments and just dismiss them entirely, because like I've said, conspiracy theories don't die in darkness. Like they thrive in it. And so you do have to address that. It's just not always the primary focus for everyone who is trying to begin this dialogue. I attempted to make that point in a video recently and got a lot of backlash for it. So I appreciate the complexity of this dialogue rather than that which happens in the comments section. Right.
Well, I mean, another thing too, he's talking about trans issues, and that is trans issues are so complicated because it's got all the complexities of any medical conversation.
Yeah.
Any medicine conversation. Like, I have ADHD, so I take medication for it. Should I be though? I mean, is it, and then should we be giving that to kids? At what age? Like, all this stuff, like, I think those are major. Deciding whether or not to give your kid a drug is something you should take very seriously.
Yeah.
And you have, and so that's in the trans conversation. So there's legitimate concerns that people are going to have, and you can get, because it's such a fight right now, because it's, I would say that the trans debate right now in America, it's like a bar fight where you can't walk in there and try and just casually say, well, I think that you're being a little bit, let's listen to, there's some wiggle room here. People are going to decide what side they think you're on, and they're going to start hitting you with their chairs. Like that's how the trans conversations are going right now in American politics. So it's really tricky. But yeah, understanding people's motives, understanding what got them into this fight in the first place, that's all totally legitimate. But I don't think you can end it there.
Yeah.
You do have to have to admit that this is a complicated problem.
Yeah. No, I think that you are operating off of a secret agenda, and you're just a total asshole because you're willing to add caveats to any of this. And this is just something that the human mind does, is we're like, oh, they're not completely on my side, and this is a hot button issue right now, so like this person is the scum of the earth. And as someone who's engaged, and I'm very passionate about like I hate even calling it a trans debate, which is like, part of like the rhetoric of my side. We do not call it a debate. It's like trans people exist. But yeah, I try to be cognizant of the fact that like I'm going to get really heated because like, I mean, what is it? I think like a quarter of all of my friends are trans. Like one of my absolute best friends is trans. Like half of the people I've even had collaborate with me on my channel are trans. And it's just a thing that, I don't know, I just get along with trans people, I guess. And so like these people are very close to me. And so it's something I'm very passionate about. And that passion can be very helpful in motivating me, but it can also make it to where I'm, more willing to just be like, this person is an asshole and think that that's a substantial argument, which like sometimes that's all you can do, but sometimes it's not. So it's really hard.
Yeah. The this actually brings back another. It's almost. I think we've almost gone 2 hours here.
We have,
but maybe it's worth just opening the door here on this one. One of the things that he said on morality, he said that there's no one thinks it's okay to kick an old lady in the shins. That's like evidence that God gave us our morals. And there, C.S. Lewis makes arguments like this, where our morality comes from God, because where else would it come from? But I mean, if you're ever living with other people and you have to cooperate to survive, when would it ever be appropriate to kick an old lady in the shins? It's just never appropriate.
Right. There is just a ridiculous irony in someone who spends their life arguing against evolution to then say, where else would morality possibly come from? I can't even think of another source. And it's like, dude, come on, you talk about it every day. Like, at least have some kind of argument against moral development, the irreducible complexity of moral paradigms. But no, instead it's just like, it couldn't have come from anywhere else, so it must be God.
Morality is how should we deal with people in our group? And as our groups expand, like you said, you have a lot of trans friends, so you're very sensitive to things that are hurting them. Mm-hmm. I know a few trans people, but not nearly as many. But I'm also sensitive to the things that are hurting them because I know some. Some people have no contact with trans people, and so they're not sensitive to it. But they know people that do have contact with them, so they can actually become sensitive to it through conversation. And I think there seems to be this trajectory of moral progress throughout history, and I think it's because we have interlocking social circles.
Yes.
And we're able to win arguments about this because, oh, look, I really care about my dogs, and so I don't want people harassing dogs and hurting dogs. And so you end up having entire governments where it's illegal to kill a dog, even if it's a stray dog. Whereas nobody cares if you kill a coyote, right?
Yeah.
In some parts of the U.S. So we have these expanding moral things just because our morals are based on this is how we treat people in our group, and that the in-group has been expanding throughout time.
I found it pretty ironic when Meyer would just repeatedly say in the podcast that atheistic materialism is reductive, or the person will say, well, and then they reduced the issue to an atheistic materialist answer and said basically what you said, which is enormously complicated. And then Meyer will turn around and say, oh, the reason why we have morality is because it's just baked into us and we don't exactly know how it was done. It's just that an intelligence designed it. Or in the instance of, science coming from Christianity, he'll be like, well, the only way that science could have possibly been developed, and the only way that it was developed for the very first time in all human history, the only reason why anyone thought that the universe could be understood, it could be predictable, and could be understood through observation was, because people trusted God, specifically the Christian God, and they thought that was a part of their theology. I don't know how familiar you are with like the early Greek philosophers. First of all, naturalism.
Oh, yeah.
Naturalism was like a valid philosophical idea for like 1,000 years before Christianity existed, basically.
But they did believe in Zeus, some of them.
Well,
some of them.
Yes, some of them did, and some of them didn't. But like the point is that you don't have to have a Christian framework in order to come to this idea. There were Chinese atheists and naturalists. I mean, there have been tribes, believe it's like called the Piraha tribe in South America, which is found to have basically an empiricist epistemology throughout like their entire culture and even in their language. It's just just like how gods can be, the idea that gods exist, anthropomorphic agents exist in multiple cultures, the idea that naturalism is a thing can also be come to from multiple different angles. If you look at like who's considered, I think, the first Greek philosopher, Thales, one of his primary ideas was that we could learn through observation because fundamentally the universe is predictable. I mean, this is like 600 years before Jesus. So, and 2,600 years or 2,500 years or something before the Protestant Reformation, my math is off there, but thousands of years before Protestant Reformation. And so I think it's actually quite a reductive answer to say that Christianity is necessary for this kind of thought that we've seen to arise from a plurality of different people groups and cultures. I don't think we need to be alarmist about that idea dying exactly. Like science, if science gets wiped out, it will be revived. If Christianity gets wiped out, it's probably not going to be. I think that's really ultimately what he's more afraid of.
Yeah, it's just funny. The logic there is, it just does not compute. It just doesn't hold water at all. But, well, we've covered a lot of ground.
Yeah.
Any final word? Oh, well, I did want to talk about, real briefly, who are the other YouTubers that are talking about biology and directly fighting against the intelligent design stuff and the creationism stuff.
Yeah. So two people that I like are Gutsick Gibbon.
Yeah, she was actually first on my list. I think she's one of the best right now that directly addresses creationism.
The facts that she delivers are great. She's able to cite her claims really well. Also, she's really funny, so that helps.
Yeah.
And then
awesome.
Also my friend Jackson Wheat. I think he does a really good job of.
He was second on my list.
Yeah, and I mean, I would say also, like, I think Rationality Rules does a really good job of putting informational videos out there. The thing is that he does what I do, which is just calls you when he wants to do that.
Yeah, his stuff isn't so much biology, but he's done stuff on creationism that's from the philosophical angle.
Yeah,
he's excellent for that. Another guy that I love, Trey the Explainer. Have you ever watched that?
Oh my God, yeah, Trey the Explainer is one of my top 3 YouTubers. I found out that he followed me on Twitter really recently, and I was freaking out. It was great. It was a great moment for me.
Trey is wonderful. His stuff is, maybe 6 years ago, he went on a big thing with paleontology. He would look at animal corpses that people thought were dinosaurs or whatever, and he'd talk about what they were. Really, really cool stuff. He has one on the biology of Avatar.
Yeah.
Did the biology of Game of Thrones, and where he would talk about, if these organisms actually did exist, how could they have evolved? So he's really good at pulling in pop culture stuff and making the science really funny and interesting because of that. He's super good.
Yeah.
There's another channel, Creation Myths, just explores creationism and points out the claims that are being made and why they're wrong. And then Nature's Compendium is another channel that I like, and he just does a bunch of stuff on different fossil organisms and what we think we know about them, why we think we know those things. And he goes into a lot of detail, and he does these reconstructed animations that are pretty cool. So
I have a couple more people on my list to check out then.
Anyone else that you would recommend? Even podcasts or other, we talked about Joe Rogan. What are podcasts that you actually listen to?
I mean, God, I just read books at this point. I feel like I often feel like there's so much that I need to learn so that I can communicate to my audience, because I never expected to get this far, that I basically don't do anything except for consume educational material. I watch Star Trek at night with my wife, but other than that, I just am reading nonfiction books.
That's awesome.
But no, I really like, it's not really debunking intelligent design or creationist stuff, but I like basically all PBS series. There's so many good PBS produced YouTube channels now. And there's things that Hank Green produces, like SciShow Tangents is a good podcast. I think that PBS Eons is one of my absolute favorite YouTube channels. And one of the channels that really influenced me to be so maybe this creationist stuff that I was taught, that evolutionism is a big lie and they don't have any leg to stand on. They're all just lying. Maybe that doesn't hold up. This actually seems pretty legit.
For people interested in the nitty gritty of paleontology, Darren Naish, he's a paleontologist. He has a podcast. I don't think it's still active, or it's really slowly active, but he does a podcast with paleo artist John Conway where they just talk about different fossils. I would say they're timeless. It doesn't matter that he didn't record it last week.
Yeah.
It's just he's going over stuff about different fossils and different arguments people have had in paleontology. And it's also, they're two British guys, and they talk about, they go on lots of tangents, but it's really fun to listen to them. I'll listen to them when I'm like, doing dishes or stuff like that. The Tet Zoo podcast. And I don't know if that's even on like Spotify and stuff, but it's tetzoo.com where you can listen to that. I do like listening to Lex Friedman's stuff on AI because, so Lex Friedman is an AI researcher, and he has this podcast. He has a lot of political stuff and a lot of like comedians on and stuff like that, but I don't really listen to that much, but his stuff on artificial intelligence is really interesting.
Got plenty of good educational resources to check out. Hopefully, a couple of people have made it to the end of this thing. So it ended up being a bit of a beast, but...
Well, yeah, thanks for coming on. It was fun.
Yeah, absolutely. Anytime. I really appreciate you helping me out with my video, because it's like, I could try to do the intelligent design stuff, but it's much better to have somebody who knows the stuff inside and out to produce something on it. So I appreciate that.